Thank you, Howard University School of Law, for inviting me to present the keynote this morning as part of the esteemed C. Clyde Ferguson Symposium on the topic of reparations. Thank you, Dean Holly Walker, Justin, my students, Demetrius and Cynthia and Eric, and the family. Wow. I'm, really honored to be here as part of this. It's really always a pleasure for me to be back here at the law school to share with students. So students, I just want to ask if it's okay if I first share just a little story that far predated all of my Howard years. I went to Howard undergrad. Okay. So I was a child of the 60s and 70s, and I came of age during the Black Power movement. So as a high school student on Saturdays around the year 1971, I used to hang out at the Black Panther Party office in DC. I took some of their political education classes. I sold their newspapers downtown in front of a popular record store. They had records in those, on F Street called Soul Shack. I was not a Panther. I just liked to sit on the lap of the fine brother with full security in the front office. Okay. But anyway, one Saturday, I was tired of standing selling papers. So during a lull, one afternoon while selling papers, I sat down on the curb and I actually opened the paper, okay, the tabloid, to the 10-point program, What We Want, What We Believe. And the graphic assertion of point number 3 always particularly grabbed me. It said that we believe that this racist government has robbed us, and now we are demanding the overdue debt of 40 acres and 2 mules. Not sure where the 2 came from. That was in there, 2 mules, okay? Promised 100 years ago as restitution for slave labor and mass murder of Black people. We will accept the payment in currency, which will be distributed to our many communities. The Germans are now aiding the Jews in Israel for the genocide of the Jewish people. The Jews murdered 6 million Jews. The American racist has taken part in the slaughter of over 50 million Black people. Therefore, we feel this is a modest demand that we make. So the absence of, quote unquote, payback for slavery, it continually flustered me because even at that young age, I knew that Black people were being kidnapped and brought to this country to labor for free as slaves, stripped of our language, our religion, our culture, raped and tortured, and then subjected to a Jim Crow era of lynchings and police brutality and inferior education and substandard housing and mediocre health care. I didn't know then about the Rosewood, Florida, or the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacres. I didn't know about the enormous profits from the enslavement era made by corporations and insurance companies and the banking and investment industries and the academic and religious institutions. But on a psychic level, I could feel in my bones the enslavement era's inhumane cruelty to Black children, its destruction of kindred ties, economic exploitation, and cultural deprivation. And there was this gnawing in my soul for amends and for redress. I was passionate about injustice. I felt that the idea of quote unquote payback to be reasonable and fair, and I vowed to talk about the concept whenever and wherever I could. My analysis, however, had not crystallized, it had not matured beyond a check. But just to mouth the word reparations, it was a starting point to its validity. So, talk about it I did, despite my views often being rejected, ridiculed, or otherwise summarily dismissed. So standing on that street corner nearly 50 years ago, little did I realize that I would one day be in the company of leading academicians, Dean Walker Holly, economists, historians, Robert Wesley there, Dr. Greg Carr, attorneys, Justin Hansford, psychiatrists, politicians, more historians. We'll be hearing from all of them today. Catherine Frankie and Marsha Chaplin, Wendy, the list goes on and on. Domestically and internationally, promoting the right to and the need for reparations. But that day will be far into the future. Despite my advocacy and that of many others during my high school, college, and law school years and beyond, the issue of reparations for Black folk in the United States, it was not fashionable It was fringe. It was definitely not part of the mainstream parlance. Indeed, one would be branded as a militant or revolutionary, both of which I was, or just plain crazy, which I was not, or in today's dubious governmental surveillance parlance, a black identity extremist. And the jury's still out on that. I don't see how one cannot be extreme about your black identity, but that's another talk for another time. But indeed, it is almost surreal today, being amidst all the buzz surrounding reparations today from universities, thank you, Howard University, religious institutions, the city councils, talk show pundits, and interestingly, at least at one point, from 2020 Democratic candidates vying for the presidency. So, reparations. The subject is hot, it's scalding, and at one time unthinkable by mainstream America as viable public policy. Yet it is only a question, should the United States government pay reparations to the descendants of Africans held as slaves? Just a question, Congressman John Conyers would muse. He said, we ask questions all of the time. You know, what's in the space, what's underneath the water? Interesting questions, he would say to me. But this one has been studiously avoided. The answer may be because few questions challenge society to consider 400 years of history all at once, to tunnel within our souls and to discover what we truly believe about race and equity and the value to be placed on human suffering. Why shouldn't the great-great-grandchildren of those who were stripped of humanity and language and culture, repeatedly raped and bred, forced to labor for free, tortured, and then after emancipation, stripped of land, subjected to inferior education, housing, health care, imperiled to mass incarceration and disenfranchisement, why should they not be compensated? Ask one question, and invariably it leads to another and yet another, and then a few more. Why? Why should white American taxpayers who never enslaved people pay for the sins of ancestors they never knew? What about those whites whose ancestors survived long after chattel enslavement period? Why should the federal government pay? What about corporations, religious, academic institutions, and private estates? Hasn't the United States already paid reparations through affirmative action? What type of price tag should be put on over 2 centuries of legalized inhumanity? Should Oprah get a check? If nothing else, one question is crystal clear. Reparations is a well-established principle of both domestic and international law. It is payment for an injury, redress for a wrong done. Although it was not popular back then, we are in an environment today when no longer are abuses to be swept under the rug. We are in an environment today where top leaders feel constrained to assert, I am not a racist. We are in an environment today that demands justice, and justice now. But we have not always been in such an environment. Indeed, the issue of reparations for African Americans was once in the not too distant past unthinkable by mainstream America as viable public policy. And the role of culpable parties has been buried for a very long time. But our history must not be buried. It must be brought out into the open. Despite, or perhaps because of today's surge in attention to this long-standing issue, I feel it critical that people understand that the demand for reparations to the United States for unpaid labor during the enslavement era and post-slavery discrimination is not novel, nor is the demand for such compensation new. The claim did not drop from the sky with Ta-Nehisi Coates' brilliant treatise, The Case for Black Reparations, in the Atlantic magazine, or from Randall Robinson's impassioned book, The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks, both of which galvanized the issue in different decades and thrust it into national conversation. It didn't start with Johnny Cochran or Charles Ogletree or Willie Gary and the energy they put into seeking reparatory justice for the ancestors of the Tulsa massacre of what was known as Black Wall Street. The claim for reparations most assertedly did not start with a hashtag on the internet. It didn't originate with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, who on the back of their newspaper year after year demanded that the United States government exempt black people from all taxation as long as we were deprived of equal justice. It didn't begin with Malcolm X or Louis Farrakhan, who in speech after speech demanded that the United States government, quote, add it up. The concept of reparations didn't begin with William Patterson, who documented the abuses of this country in his historical treatise, We Charge Genocide, or with Marcus Garvey. He talked about repatriation, not jumping into the ocean naked, but with reparation. The concept of reparations did not begin with the end of the Civil War, when in response to the demands of African-descendant people, the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate voted to provide freed families with the hallowed 40 acres, only to have the bill vetoed by Andrew Johnson. The concept of reparations did not begin with Belinda Royal and her petition in Massachusetts for a pension from her ex-enslaver's estate during the 1700s. It didn't start with Callie House and Isaiah Dickinson and their ex-slaves Bounty and Mutual Pension Association, which between 1887 and 1890 had 700,000 dues-paying members. It didn't start with our great Queen Mother Audley Moore or Reparations Ray Jenkins, President Mario Bedelli, who kept the issue alive their entire lives. The demand for reparations in the United States has been long and continuous. Reparations is a well-established principle of international law. It is not, as some has characterized it, as another way of begging the United States for handouts. It is not welfare. It is payment for a debt owed. In the context of black people in America, the quest for reparations essentially constitutes 4 elements. Number 1, the formal acknowledgement of historical wrong and an official, unfettered apology for the dehumanization and atrocities of the enslavement era and beyond. Number 2, the recognition that the injury has continued throughout the years and still manifests today. Number 3, the commitment to redress by the federal government, which sanctioned the enslavement and subsequent segregation, and by corporate entities and academic and religious institutions, as well as private estates, all of which enjoyed unjust enrichment from the era, and the actual compensation in whatever form or forms are agreed upon. As lawyers, as law students, we might ask, well, doesn't the legal doctrine of laches vitiate the debt? You see, laches is based on the maxim that equity aids the vigilant and not those who slumber on their rights. The doctrine of laches operates against one who neglects to assert a claim upon which such neglect, considered with the passage of time, harms the adverse parties. So I'd say with respect to the lapse of time, as I pointed out, there has been no substantial period during the era since enslavement, or even during enslavement, when our people neglected the campaign and claim for reparatory justice. But you know what? Even if we had, okay, it has been the power of the United States and its refusal to consider reparations for us, which has frustrated our efforts heretofore, not any failure to pursue demands on our part. Post-slavery discrimination and Jim Crow notwithstanding, it is pertinent to recognize that these events ceased scarcely 120 so years ago. I've heard no suggestion that the inheritance laws in the United States be changed so that everyone else who is benefiting from a legacy accumulated 120 years ago forgoes it. It's another question that arises. I hear it all the time. I am innocent. I should not be held liable for things that happened over 100 years ago. That was my great-great-grandfather, and anyway, I'm a liberal. I'm a progressive. Well, we all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Although the present generation of whites may be innocent of what their forefathers, and foremothers, did, as a people, they are in a privileged position because of the actions of their predecessors. Each generation passes its debts as well as its assets on to the next generation. The heritage which whites enjoy in this country is what has been called white skin privilege. They benefit from a society, from a state, from an economic structure which is governed by white supremacy. And although we may debate methods of operationalizing this data for measurement, there is no question that Caucasians in this country enjoy the fruits of over 300 years of unjust enrichment as a result of the stolen labor of African people. You see, reparations is owed by the government because of the wrongs committed by the government, even though many people may not have agreed with the government. In fact, since American tax dollars will and have paid for reparations in the future as well as in the past, in some ways, all of us, you won't think of it like that, some ways, all of us, even African Americans, bear the brunt of paying for reparations. You do know, don't you, that it was African American tax dollars that were part of the reparations settlement that paid for the Japanese Americans and the benefits to Native Americans. But it was the end of the 20th century that brought renewed vigor to the call for reparations for people of African descent in the United States with the founding of NCOBA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America in 1987. And as Justin pointed out, I was a founding member of that organization at that September 26, 1987 historic gathering, which brought together diverse groups under one umbrella, from the Republic of New Africa to the National Conference of Black Lawyers. The demand for reparations in the United States, it substantially leaped forward, generating what I call the modern day reparations movement. But then something real critical happened around that same time. Something very, very critical, 1987 and 1988. Does anybody know what that was? It was the passage and the signing of the Civil Liberties Act, which granted reparations to Japanese Americans for their unjust internment during World War II. And so we in NCOBA and in the reparations movement in general, we looked at the passage of that bill and we said, wait a minute now, excuse me. If they could do it for the Japanese Americans, there is no excuse as to why it cannot be done for black folk, having ignored the claim of black people in the United States for centuries. So we decided to be strategic. Hey, let's follow the same path that was successful with the Japanese Americans. It worked for them, it should work for us. That was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we worked very closely with Congressman John Conyers, who modeled a bill following the exact approach used by the Japanese Americans to first establish a federally chartered commission to study the issue and then to make recommendations to Congress on appropriate remedies. The bill's number, H.R. 40, was in remembrance of the unfulfilled 19th century campaign promise to give free blacks 40 acres and a mule. So what is it that this Japanese American redress bill did? Well, in a nutshell, it authorized the payment of $20,000 to each Japanese American detention camp survivor, a trust fund to be used to educate Americans about the sufferings of the Japanese Americans, a formal apology from the United States government, and guess what else? People don't talk about this part. A pardon for all of those who resisted detention camp internment. Get back to that later. It is a sad commentary. It is a sad commentary that the United States government has not taken responsibility for its role in enslavement and post-slavery segregation of millions of blacks. It has never attempted reparations to African Americans for the extortion of labor for many generations, deprivation of their human rights, and terrorism against them throughout the centuries. Now, the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives did pass symbolic resolutions apologizing for slavery and segregation. However, can you believe the gall? The 2009 bill passed by the Senate contained a disclaimer that those seeking reparations or cash compensation could not use that apology to support any type of legal claim against the United States. But it is H.R. 40 that has provided the cover and a mechanism to have a public policy conversation about the issue of reparations in the Congress of the United States. Now, Nkechi, people often question me, why you always be focusing on the federal government? Wasn't all of the injury done by the states? Why is the federal government so critical? So, I didn't learn none of this in school and learn it in church and learn it at work, anything along those lines. But when you really look at it, the answer to that question, and much, much more about the enslavement role, era and the role of culpable partners, has been buried for a long time. I always love to quote the words of Mamie Till Mobley, the Chicago mother of 14-year-old Emmett Till, who in 1955 was abducted by whites from bed in his great-uncle's home and thrown into Mississippi's Tallahatchie River. So, the only way her sons badly beaten and brutally tortured and disfigured body could be identified with by a ring he wore on his finger. But you know, his mama made me tell, she refused in closed casket. She said, I don't want to bury his memory under the rug. She stated emphatically, I want to open up the casket. Open it up, she demanded. I want the world to see what they did to my boy. And just as that casket was opened up for the world to see what was done to Emmett Till, this is what we're going to be doing today, during this whole day. We're going to be opening up the casket of the legacy of enslavement, and we're going to talk about remedy. You see, the answer to that question about why the federal government, we must remember the origins of the black nation in the United States. We are the descendants of Africans who were kidnapped and transported to the United States with the explicit complicity of the United States government and every single arm of the United States lawmaking and law enforcing machinery, U.S. federal law, state law, high court decisions, lower court decisions, the dehumanization, the atrocities, the terrorism of our enslavement in the United States were not isolated occurrences, but they were a matter of war. War conducted under the specific authority of the United States Constitution. Let's open up that casket. The kidnapping was a wrongful act for which our ancestors and we as their heirs are entitled to damages. The enslavement was a wrongful act for which our ancestors and we as their heirs are entitled to damages. The stealing of our labor was a wrongful act, as was the genocide that we are still suffering. We are entitled to damages, to reparations, to reparatory justice. The compensations we speak of are owed to us. Again, we're not taught it like this. The information with analysis has been buried for a long time. U.S. Constitutional Article 1, Clause 1, Section 9 expressly guaranteed and sanctioned the continued importation of African prisoners of war to every state that might desire us until the year 1801. Language is important. That's part of the narrative. They weren't slaves that came to this country. They came as prisoners of war. And when you start using international terms, then you can start availing yourself of international remedies. Open up that casket. That article also upheld the further dehumanization of the African by relegating our status to that of 3/5 of a white man. And most egregious, it was war conducted against the African on this soil under the authority of yet another constitutional provision, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, known as the fugitive slave provision, which mandated that no enslaved person, none of us, even if he or she had reached a free state, none of us was saved. And it was the duty. It was the legal obligation. It was the constitutional responsibility of every single white man, woman, or child to deliver up the escaped African up to the U.S. government. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, recognized the freedom of all enslaved Africans, made it illegal to continue slavery except for that ridiculous acceptance punishment for a crime clause. Y'all know what I'm talking about, Ava DuVernay. Hopefully, if you don't know, Google up the 13th. But no payment, however, was made for stolen labor, land, and cultural rape and economic exploitation. In fact, Dred Scott's case had been decided scarcely 8 years prior, in which a Supreme Court justice ruled what? Well, you know what? A black person in America had what? No rights, which a white person was bound to respect. And that neither Dred Scott nor any other black person could be a citizen of the United States in the manner in which that word was used in the Constitution. See, when they wrote the preamble, we, the people of the United States, they meant we, the white people. Although the 13th Amendment set no restrictions on the freedom of formerly enslaved people, the 14th Amendment, passed 2.5 years later, robbed them of some of their hard-won freedom. Now I say, what you talking about here now? Okay, don't get mad at me, but the 14th Amendment imposed the obligation of U.S. citizenship upon the African American without his or her informed consent or the benefits of that citizenship, and without any meaningful discussion of political alternatives inherent in the international right to self-determination. So let's just break this down just a bit. Greg Carr, the audacity. How are you going to take a free person and tell him that he's got to become part of your family? Especially since you castrated his father, you raped his mother, you sold his children to your relatives. Didn't ask him if he wanted to join your family. Didn't ask him if he wanted to start his own family. If the African were free, then no one, not even the ex-slaveholder, could define the African's future status for him and impose a status upon him. This was the right of the newly freed persons, the Africans alone. It was the fruit of the right to self-determination. This analysis must not be continually swept under the rug. It must be brought out into the light of day. We need to open up that casket. And that is why it's pertinent to understand that reparations is not only an economic concept, it is a political concept as well as a cultural one. Reparations are not limited to stolen labor, but also for unjust war and cultural aggression as well. The political essence of slavery is not founded merely in the economic exploitation of labor, but in the illegal imposition of U.S. jurisdiction on the enslaved and her descendants. It can never be overemphasized that black people on this soil, as a result of warfare, supported by the United States and other nations, are here as a result of a vicious colonization, cultural rape, economic exploitation under chattel and mental bondage and terror, and the full ramifications of this historical record must not be endlessly ignored. We got to open up that casket. See, that's why H.R. 40 is so important. Every time we ran away, it didn't matter if we just walked away, tiptoed away quietly in the night, Harriet Tubman. It didn't matter if we organized elaborate insurrections in Marvisy. It didn't matter if we fled to Pennsylvania or New York. They were going to come after us with their armed forces, patty bowlers, militia, and dogs. And why didn't it matter? Because the white folk decided that they were going to live here. Wasn't going to be no 100 years of Palmares liberation. Okay, no Gangazumbi here. They vowed that they would not just let us walk off into the woods and swamps and develop our own, and they go back to France or England or Spain because it got too hot. This was not going to be their vacation spot. They had planned to stay, and so they chased us, and they pursued us, and they tracked us down, and they beat us, and they castrated us, and they lynched us, and they sought to quell all forms of resistance. But don't forget, it was not just the enslavement era. Reparations are owed for what happened after enslavement and what is still happening today. Whether we're talking about the convict leasing system, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, housing exclusions, to redlining, racial application of the death penalty, mass incarceration, disproportionately impacting black people, we gotta connect the dots. So my brothers and sisters, when we see that video of the ruthless pursuit, chasing and breaking down a Walter Scott in South Carolina like a runaway slave just a few years ago, when we see the gunning down of Michael Brown, Justin, in Ferguson, like a dog in the street. When we see Eric Garner in New York being choked to death and the countless others, all by those who have been sworn to uphold the law, we know that there is a connection between the U.S. criminal punishment system and the necessity for reparatory justice. Ladies, when we hear about the brutal gynecological experiments on enslaved women devoid of anesthesia, which led to modern medicine, we are witness to the connection between the disparities in the healthcare system and the need for reparatory justice. There is a connection, Robert Wesley, between the lack of economic opportunity, the racial wealth gap, not racial wealth gap, the racial wealth gorge, and it must be redressed. When we see that prison beds are constructed on the test scores of little black boys in the 3rd grade, we know that there is a connection between the educational system and the necessity for reparatory justice. There is a connection between post-traumatic slavery syndrome and post-incarceration stress syndrome and the necessity for reparatory justice. There is a connection. And each harm must be compensated. And it is past time that the role of the federal government be pushed out. H.R. 40, front and center, is the vehicle. Open up that casket. So the issue of reparations for African Americans was once, and not too distant past, unthinkable, again, by Americans as viable public policy. But since the introduction of the Reparations Study Bill, we've had state legislators, we've had scores of city councils across the country pass reparations-type legislation. We had I'm going to just skip through some of this, but there was a $10 million settlement to the victims and control group of the heirs of the Tuskegee syphilis study, where over almost 400 black men over a 40-year period were left untreated, okay, to study the... There was funds paid to the 11 survivors of 1923 Rosewood Race Massacre Scholarship Fund. There was a scholarship and memorial to commemorate the Tulsa race riot that happened, where we're talking about over 300 people murdered in the streets in cold blood, 40 blocks of exclusively black businesses, you name it, just completely obliterated. The lawsuit didn't win, but there was some type of claim with respect to the legislature. In 2015, Chicago City Council passed a reparations ordinance providing an apology and $20 million to the survivors and families of law enforcement torture. I know nobody was here when I used to teach a course here, racial disparity in the criminal justice system. And long before this issue really came to public attention, there was this little video dealing with this police torture going on in Chicago. And I always try to bring current, relevant things to the class. So I would bring this video out, and then years later, as Justin Hansford brought out, Charles Ogletree and folk brought a petition before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on that issue, and Chicago ultimately passed a reparations ordinance as a result of that torture that disproportionately impacted black people. It provided an apology, $20 million to survivors and their families, including psychological counseling, health services, vocational training, free city college education, the creation of public memorials, and a requirement that the history of that police torture and the community struggle for accountability be part of the Chicago public schools system. That's an example. That was just a couple of years ago in Chicago. Just last October, I was part of a team, part of a NAARC, National African American Reparations Commission team that went to Evanston, Illinois, to provide support for a young alderman, Robin Ruth Simmons, who successfully got a bill passed that would transfer a percentage of the tax revenue from the sale of legal recreational cannabis to fund reparatory justice projects in the city, which have been hard hit by redlining and other racially exclusionary policies. Reparations advocates have also challenged corporations who benefited from profits made from the trafficking in human beings, whether we're talking about countless companies and industries benefited and enriched from these profits, including companies that sold life insurance policies on the lives of enslaved people like Aetna and New York Life. AIG is hitting kind of close to home, y'all, right? Financial gains were accrued by predecessor banks of financial giants like JP Morgan, Chase, Bank of America. Others with documented ties to slavery included railroads like Norfolk Southern, CSX, Union Pacific, Canadian National, newspaper publishers that assisted in the capture of runaways. So y'all seen the, wanted this runaway slave and a picture with him on a knapsack on his back, they made money on these ads, okay? Night Rider, Tribune, E.W. Scripps, Gannett, the financial backers of many of the country's top universities were wealthy slave owners, and it's now common knowledge. We all know that the sole reason that Georgetown University survives today is because the Jesuits who ran the college used the profits from the sale of black people to save it from foreclosure. Universities and, yes, churches are beginning to open up their caskets. Virginia Theological Seminary, Princeton Seminary, Episcopal Church are examples. Numerous civil and human rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let me just go on. Arguably more devastating than the loss of black life was and is the destruction wreaked by the U.S. by cultural genocide and the impact of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. Now, I know y'all saying, Nkechi, well, you a lawyer, what you talking about? This medical term, you can't even pronounce it. Okay, so you said, so what the hell? Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. So I learned this from psychiatrist Dr. Pat Newton, Dr. Nana Pat Newton. She said, it travels with your DNA, people, okay? It's a phenomenon that the environment can modify how your genes are expressed without a change in the DNA code. There was a study of third-generation Holocaust survivors. Researchers found that they had inherited genes that had been transformed as a result of their ancestors' trauma, okay? Similar to the trauma that descendants of the Holocaust inherited, okay? The black community has inherited centuries of intergenerational trauma as a result of not only the enslavement era, but also the Jim Crow apartheid system, and also the system of mass incarceration, all of which correlate with negative health outcomes and other issues. We really need to open up that casket. And if you just came to this country and wondering what type of trauma we're speaking of, just a glance at some of the conditions that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of with respect to the tightening of black codes just gives you just a little glimpse. He says that they could own nothing, they could make no contracts, they could not testify in court, they could not control their children, they could hold no property, they could not hire out, they could not legally marry nor constitute families, they could not appeal from their masters, they could be punished at will, they could not testify in court, they could be imprisoned by their owners, and the criminal offense of assault and battery could not be committed on the person of a slave. The slave owed to his master and family a respect without bounds. In absolute obedience, this authority could be transmitted to others. A slave could not sue his master, had no right of redemption, no right to education or religion. A promise made to a slave by his master had no force or validity. Children followed the condition of the slave mother. The slave could have no access to the judiciary. A slave could be condemned to death for striking a white person. The entire legal apparatus was used by those with the power to do so to establish a legal tradition that sought to strip black people of all human dignity, genocide. We are entitled to reparations. The compensations we speak of are owed to us. There is no statute of limitations on redressing human rights violations, and debts are neither absolved nor diminished by the passage of time. In fact, over time, Sherman Rogers, unpaid debts grow larger with added interest. And speaking of the issue of genocide, I would be totally remiss if I did not very, very briefly share with you the internationally accepted definition of genocide and let you juxtapose that definition against the conditions black people face in society. The international definition: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or in part. It goes on. But it also says that genocide is not the only punishable act. There's also conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in its commission. And that's not all. The definition goes on to say that those found guilty of genocide shall be punished, regardless of whether they are constitutionally protected rulers, Donald Trump, public officials, or private citizens. Now listen to this. This is very important, because when I was in law school, this was being passed. Didn't learn about it in law school, but this is the analysis that I did. The Genocide Convention is the only human rights treaty, the only one currently that is enforceable in U.S. law. The only one that came with it, I don't know if Lisa Coons is in this room, the only one that came with it implementing legislation. All the other human rights treaties, civil and political rights, women, torture, etc., they're what's called non-self-governing, not the Genocide Convention. Who's going to open up that casket? Who's going to make the connection with reparations, with reparatory justice? It's right there, it's in the law. We're not using it. Okay, I'm just going to go on down to the affirmative action does not make anything all right. I don't even need to address that. Y'all, I mean, come on. Yeah, okay. Let's just skip that. So then finally, as I come to a close, mobilization must not be limited to the victims of the enslavement. My white colleague, Katrina Brown, uncovered evidence that her ancestors were the largest slave trading family in U.S. history. She documented her roots in, that they brought her family. Brought over 10,000 Africans to the Americas in chains in her film called Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north. And I'm talking about the South, the deep north. She's taken her story across the U.S. and Europe, stressing that the slave trade was not just a few people taking a boat and sending it out. She says that everybody in the town lived off of slavery. The boat maker, the iron worker who made the shackles, the coopers who made the barrels to hold the rum, the distillers who took the molasses and sugar and made into the rum. Literally the whole town was dependent on the slave trade in the North. Wealth and privilege in the United States, she says, has been amassed in large measure as a direct or indirect consequence of the institution of slavery. And now for the doozy elephant question in the room, is reparations just about the money? Give me my check. Absolutely not. Reparations is not just about the money, but let's not get it twisted. Cash payments are not to be excluded. While they remain an important and necessary component of any claim for damages, I mean, anything you do in the law, you have someone hit you with a truck and, you get injured, you're going to get paid. But it is crystal clear today that a reparations settlement can be fashioned in so many ways as necessary to equitably address the countless manifestations of injury sustained from chattel slavery and its continuing vestiges. Some forms of redress may include land, economic development, scholarships. Other amends may embrace community development, repatriation resources, truthful textbooks. Still other areas of reparatory justice may encompass the erection of monuments and museums, the upkeep of ancestral burial grounds, pardons for impacted prisoners from the COINTELPRO era. Remember I said Japanese American redress bill, a pardon for all those who resisted detention, camp internment. There are people in prison now, been in prison almost 50 years from the Black Panther, Black Power era. We don't even speak their names. I go to jail for Nelson Mandela and the end to apartheid. Where are people in the streets for Sundiata Acoli and Mutulu Shakur and Assata who can't even come back into this country? A pardon for all those who were victims of that war in terms of that particular period. So, in conclusion, 50 years, and I'm only 55 years old, 50 years after I first entered the reparations movement as a teenager, I'm finally optimistic. It's hard not to be when H.R. 40 has been updated to include not just a mere study of proposals, but also their development. It's also hard not to be optimistic when a Senate companion bill to H.R. 40 has been introduced, and even more astonishing when some Democratic candidates for the 2020 presidential race are saying that they will sign the legislation if elected president. Despite a resurfacing of white supremacy in the U.S., I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I am buoyed. I can't pronounce B-U-O-Y-E-D, buoyed. I can't pronounce the word. But I am that by the reemergence of the spirits of Belinda and Callie House and Queen Mother Moore, as well as the resilience of Reparations Ray Jenkins, who kept the fire alive in Congressman John Conyers year after year to introduce H.R. 40. I am inspired by everybody in this room who are dedicated to struggling to opening up that casket of the enslavement era and beyond. And I'm inspired by the words of our great anti-slavery orator, Frederick Douglass, who once stated, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." Those who profess the favor of freedom, yet depreciate agitation, are those who want the crops without plowing up the ground. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its mighty waters. They want the rain without the thunder and the lightning. He said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. The demand has been made, and the time is now to seriously consider reparations. Reparations now. So I'm not sure if there's time for any questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think if there might be one or two questions, I know we're kind of up on time.
We'd like to thank our keynote speaker for such a wonderful address. And now we're getting into our question and answer portion of the discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come up to the first two microphones at this time. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm talking a lot today. Thank you for bringing the fire to wake us up, because we need to wake up. You talked about it's international, and there's a very strong movement in Jamaica for reparations. How do we all come together and, present a united front in different parts of the world for basically the same injustices?
Thank you so very much for this question. A lot of people don't know that we are in the 5th year of the International Decade of People of African Descent, and it's provided a wonderful opportunity to really connect with our brothers and sisters across the diaspora. We work very closely with CARICOM, the community of Caribbean nations, who has also adopted a 10-point program for reparatory justice from their respective European colonizers. We've been working with people in Sweden and France and England and Germany and in Brazil, African descendant people who are all talking about the same issue now, reparations now, and the need for reparatory justice. So those conversations are happening. It's not as widespread as it should and needs to be, but I fervently believe that we need to take this opportunity of the International Decade of People of African Descent to make sure it happens. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. This is kind of a follow-up question to the last question. So in the Black or Afro-descendant community, the only conflict I see around this is whether people who are not American or African descendants of slaves or whatever word they want to use now should be entitled to reparations. Mm-hmm. And I see a lot of conflict over that. So I wonder if you could address that, that conflict and how we should deal with it.
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, there's a lot of Twitterverse stuff going on, I guess you could say. Unfortunately, a lot of it is becoming very divisive, I guess you could say, and causing people to lose sight of the central question and the central issue. One of the reasons why I personally do not feel that a check is the only method of compensation is that it's very hard to delineate who is the actual person to benefit from that. For example, in my own situation, my mother's family is from the islands. They moved to New York in the early 1900s. My mother was born in New York, but they came from the islands. My father's folk were from the South, North Carolina, et cetera, et cetera. What some people are saying is that if people were not part of the direct lineage of direct line from enslavement, that they should not benefit from reparations. That is why community reparations or general benefits, in addition to direct benefits, are very important. We had not just the enslavement era, but we had the Jim Crow era. We have the stuff that's still happening today. My mother's family went through all of that, through the whole Jim Crow. We won't even go through the many things that they went through, but they were impacted as well, should they not be able to collect. Also, I don't feel I should have to personally submit myself to a DNA test to prove my father's side of the test. First of all, I honestly, because of the results in enslavement, I don't even know who my father's name is. I don't even know, I can't even trace back. And with all the information that's out there and issues with surveillance and governmental identity theft and all like that, there's a lot of questions about even these DNA tests and the like. So I personally do not agree with solely looking at the direct lineage approach. We look at collective or general reparations as well. And most Black people who are here, who have been here for a long time, definitely were impacted, not by enslavement, but by the enslavement era, its aftermath, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, that intergenerational epigenetic thing that I talked about, dealing with the trauma that's in the DNA. So I'm sure that during the course of this day, that issue will probably come up and people can share their perspectives. I will say, there's not one right answer to all of this. We're just now opening up these caskets. I mean, I got to be which is, again, another reason why H.R. 40, a commission to study and look at these issues, are so very important. It's not just for one person or one entity on the internet or one person standing before a podium or one Democratic candidate or whatever to be able to say what the answer is. This has to come as a result of study and discussion and everyone coming together so we can formulate what is the best path forward. So I really appreciate your question. I think that's it. Thank you.